Welcome to the East Main Podcast. I am your host, Brian Brodeur, and thank you for listening. This episode is part 3 of my conversation with former Chief Executive of Solid State Logic, Piers Plaskitt. In this episode, we hear about his adventures owning and operating Stella's Blue Sky Diner in Iowa. And in that conversation, we find out his secret to making a great milkshake. Also, Piers tells me about the importance of integrity and loyalty in business. But to start out, we'll pick up where we left off in part 2. Let's hear about Piers' interactions with the Beatles at Apple Studios in London. Of course, I have to ask the obligatory question, what, if any, interactions you had with any of the 4 Beatles?
The one I didn't interact with was John, which rather sadly, because he was sort of banished, wrong word, locked in the US during his green card application.
Right.
I met Yoko. Yoko came to the studio. I did some work with Ringo. Ringo had a company called ROR. It was a furniture company.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
He did exotic reproduction furniture, and I worked on the project for perhaps one of a more bizarre customer, the Shah of Iran.
Okay. Not everybody can say that. All right.
It's not on my resume.
And how did that go?
Well, it was just putting together back then what would be called a hi-fi system to go into this furniture.
Sure. Right.
I met Paul, who came, I think, for a mastering session. George, I've got to get my years right. I think I met George at Tittenhurst Park at his studio. All just, thoroughly decent, normal human beings.
And of course, contributed wonderful music.
Oh, yeah, there was that too.
Can you compare working in London with New York? Because you've described in your conversation with me, doing both. Can you just describe the differences?
The Beatles had a big meeting in New York, obviously, because John couldn't leave, because they wanted to decide what they were going to do with their various businesses. There was Apple Clothing and some other things. We knew that the studio was fine because it was very profitable and everything was great. However, the outcome of that meeting was that they closed everything except for, the core Apple Corp, right, or Apple Corps, to manage the royalties and the affairs of the Beatles and so forth.
Yeah. And
so suddenly word came from New York, Apple Studios was closing. Everybody got fired except me, because I was the cheapest on the payroll.
Interesting.
So I stayed on for an additional month while people sort of trundled through, and they were buying equipment and so forth. And some regrets about my time there, because there was a massive tape library.
Yeah.
Which I looked at, and that's all I did. But hey, so anyway, left Apple, went to Trident Studios.
Sure, world famous place, of course.
And I was there for a couple of years, and one of the mastering engineers left to go to New York City for a job, and he was corresponding back to us about how much money he was making. He was making $1,000 a week, and we were like, "That's impossible."
And again, timestamp this. This is later 70s, right? This has got to be 76 or 77, maybe. Am I right?
Yeah. 6, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So $1,000 a week at the studio in New York.
Yeah. And as a mastering engineer. And it was because, his brand was, I did a bunch of albums for very famous UK bands.
Sure.
And we were like, it's impossible. There's no way. But to answer your question, the difference then between a UK recording studio and, let's say, New York recording studio, because I say London and New York were my geographical experience.
Right.
In London, it was very much the school of hard knocks. You joined as a T-boy, whether you were a man or a woman, you were a T-boy. And guess what you did? You made tea.
Yeah.
All day, every day, tray after tray. You carry around what generically referred to as by some as trucker. And you made everybody tea all day. If you did that well for maybe a year, you might be allowed to move a microphone in the studio. And eventually, if you endured that abuse of almost no money and endless tea making, you graduated to being an assistant engineer. And that, working around some phenomenal engineers, sort of trial by fire, you eventually became a recording engineer. And that process, from your first cup of tea to your first major album, was maybe 5 years. And it was the same throughout London recording studios in the 70s.
Sure.
Much to my despair, my first day at the recording studio in New York, nobody made me tea. I had to make it myself. I said, "Where's the tea boy?" They were like, "What's that?"
Yeah, what are you talking about?
"You're the tea boy." But I overnight tripled my salary.
Right. Yeah.
Doing exactly pretty much the same job, fixing stuff. And the cost of living between London and New York, almost identical. So I was immediately in a whole new place.
Right. Fascinating. So I'm going to take a big left turn now because we're going to talk about cost of living, because you're in Iowa. And I want to hear about Stella's Blue Sky Diner.
Oh,
right. Because you get out of the pro audio business, and decide that you want to get into the restaurant business. Tell me about the diner and tell me about why that was appealing to you.
It was appealing for perhaps many of the wrong reasons. And I'm sure you're familiar with the old joke about the music business, and it's how to make $1 million in the music business is you start with 10 million. It's the same in the restaurant business, except I didn't have $10 million. I'm used to working hard for a living, and I love entertaining. And I thought that the 1950s diner vibe, we had a 1956 Seaberg jukebox, fully reconditioned. We had all the remote heads re-chromed and upgraded the electronics, and, put far too much money into the way that the diner sounded.
Of course you did. Of course you did. Please continue.
I was one of the few people that noticed. I think. But it was, and this is certainly not unique to me. I think that anybody who's ever owned and operated any restaurant will tell you it's very much a labor of love. And we went into it full steam. We had a great team. The demographic of the serving staff was high school, so 17, 18-year-old, which meant every August a whole slew of them left, and we had to bring in a whole new slew. We spent a lot of time on training. I had a general manager for a while who complained about how much time we're spending on training. He says, you train these kids and then they leave. And I said, well, what happens if we don't train them and they stay? And, training is so important in any business. But if you're talking about a high school kid and teaching them the Sullivan nod, which is a way to get people to nod with you, teaching them to upsell, it's a business. And, my kids were young, but one of the wonderful things about the labor laws is that you can bring your kids and have them work in your own business at virtually any age.
Right.
Now, you're not going to put them around the fryer in the kitchen, but having my 9-year-old greet customers and take them to a table was a wonderful thing. And then there were the milkshakes.
Yeah.
We got it to a point where we had 100 different flavors of milkshake. Perhaps one of the more bizarre ones was bacon and egg, but it's sort of breakfast in a cup.
What was your favorite flavor?
There was something that I knew nothing about, which is malt.
Okay. Yeah.
Malt powder. And in diner language, you have a shake or you have a malt. And adding malt powder to a milkshake elicits this wonderful flavor dimension of yumminess. If anybody knows, Maltesers candy, that's what's in the middle of them. I suppose my favorite was pretty simple. I think strawberry, banana, vanilla, probably something like that.
That's a good one. Of course, diners, here in the States, if you were in high school in the 50s, you'd meet up with your friends at the malt shop.
Yep.
And that, of course, is referring to how the shakes or how the drinks were made with malt.
Yep.
And we don't necessarily see that anymore. And certainly teenagers are on TikTok. They're not meeting at the malt shop, but that doesn't really exist. So that is really a fascinating thing. 100 flavors. I want to ask you, how is running Stella's Blue Sky Diner similar to running a recording studio?
Interesting. Well, both businesses have a couple of things that are sort of identical. You need a good crew and you need to take care of your customers. And I think that a recording studio, you are often, once you're in session, unless you are the engineer or producer, you're pretty much keep to yourself. And there's very rarely milkshakes spilled on the floor. I think that in what I encouraged in the diner and within solid state logic as well is there's no such thing as a bad idea. And so in our morning meetings before the rush started, anybody could bring up anything, whether it was, one could hope, some cost saving measure or perhaps a new flavor of shake or whatever. We printed our own menus, so it was very easy to update them. But so much of it is about customer care. And I think owner-operators can spend so much time in the back room doing the books and operating and worrying about the bottom line.
Yeah.
They forget to go out there and talk to people that bring them business. It's really easy to get loyalty.
I would like to dig into this. I'm fascinated. Go ahead.
Loyalty versus repeat business. I think that one of the biggest challenges of any business is building customer loyalty.
Right.
And key thing about the word loyalty is what a customer will overlook, what a customer will tolerate. I think if you mess up, whether it's the steak isn't done to the right temperature, or you spill something on a table or whatever, how you recover from that will affect how that individual views you and your company. And, the Chinese symbol for crisis is the combination of the symbol for danger and the symbol for opportunity.
Right.
And I think in any business, if you're faced with something that's gone wrong or even horribly wrong, my lesson to my team, whether it was in the restaurant or within solid state logic, is, okay, how are we going to come back from this stronger than the way that we went into it?
Yeah.
And how are we going to ensure that person that we just upset will forgive us? And you got to work hard at that. And I think that successful businesses know how to do that. I think Apple's a pretty good example, the Steve Jobs Apple rather than the Beatles.
Apple computer. Yeah.
I mean, the very first time I broke the screen on my phone was the day before I was going to be flying out on a business trip. And I zoomed over to Apple. The guy said, let me take a look at this. And came back with a new phone and says, here you go. I said, what?
Right.
Have I bought any other phones since then? That kind of behavior generates extraordinary loyalty. And it's a wonderful thing.
Sure. Yeah.
I traveled many millions of miles on various airlines. I joined American Airlines Frequent Flyer Club right around the year that it was launched, which was 30, 40 years ago. And in 2019, they made me a concierge key person.
Yeah.
Which I was surprised about because I didn't fly 10 million miles like George Clooney, but concierge key, wow, there is some serious customer recognition. When you land, when you step off the plane, there's somebody standing there who will whisk you down an outside stairway, down to a Cadillac SUV, zip you across the tarmac. I mean, this is rock star treatment.
Yeah.
And out of all of the loyalty clubs I have joined over the years, American Airlines sort of head and shoulders above everybody else. And, the first time somebody met me at the door, I'm like, oh, wow. The second time, the third time, the 10th time, I'm like, this is like amazing. And I began to get used to it. And I thought, well, be careful. This is only for a year. At the end of this, you're back to being a pleb. And I managed to, bring my kids on a couple of flights with me. And that was sort of just so that they could see, all that time I spent away from you. Here's small recognition from a vendor who's saying, thank you. And, when the captain comes back, in a scene from the movie and comes up to your chair and at the seat and says, I noticed your name on the manifest and wanted to thank you for all of your business. And like,
wow,
you're welcome. And these are my daughters. So, yeah, I mean, that's a loyalty program and one that Americans certainly got very right. So my advice is be loyal to your vendors because it will reap dividends.
Your career has spanned a period where everything went from analog, completely analog, there was no digital, to now essentially nearly everything is digital, and the tools are at our fingertips as creatives, not just pro audio people, but the tools are in the hands of creatives at a very widespread and accessible way. Can you briefly reflect on that change and how things were created and how the business was done when you first started Apple Studios and then to Trident and onward, and then now where the Grammy Award winning engineer for Billie Eilish, her brother, is doing everything in his bedroom with a laptop, right? And wins the most engineered Grammys ever, or whatever that is. Give me your reflection on that change. Yeah. Love to hear your 2 cents.
As an operator, as an engineer, my career was only in analog, and we had some wonderful times, turning the multi-track tape upside down to record reverse echo, and being really careful that you're not erasing the bass drum, because that's the only way to get reverse echo was, to record it on a track of a multi-track. Yeah. Worked on an album with Miko. It was the disco version of the Star Wars theme.
Sure, of course, yeah.
The cantina scene was trombones recorded at, I think the final product was at 15. So I'm going to go with the trombones were recorded like at 7.5 IPS and then played back octave higher at 15 and got that wonderful, goofy, cantina sound. And so having 3 people work on the final mix that are, working the mutes and so forth. And if you didn't have enough people doing a window pane edit into the multi-track to cut out the click that you couldn't mute. And so I think that it pushed the creative envelope to no end. What can we do that's different?
Meaning there were limitations, and the limitations had made you think creatively. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, because the limitations of the technology, how can you come up with different ways of doing it?
Yeah.
And of course, today, all of that stuff is available at the push of a button. Then I think, for the most part, that's wonderful. I think that it allows for a huge amount of creativity. The thing I worry about a little bit is that if you're not limited by the technology, how many vocal takes are you actually going to take?
Yeah.
And if you end up with 76, how on earth are you going to figure out which is the best one? If you've got 3 tracks for vocals and you're trying to do a comp, you'll make it work. Or even 1 track in some. I worked on a Pointer Sisters album where we had to jump between tracks because I can't remember the producer's name. Richard Perry.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
He'd erased some lead vocals, and the girls were very upset with him. And boy, that was a packed multi-track. And I heard it for the first time when he brought it in, and we had to record right then and there. And I didn't have a mix up, and it's like, oh, it was fun. It was fun. Nothing like a bit of pressure.
Yeah, there's no undo button. There's no Command Z to undo, hitting that record button.
And the cool thing about being an engineer in those days is that you came with the room. You were considered to be, sort of on par with the guy that it wasn't considered much of a science. And I must admit that I never considered myself to be a particularly brilliant engineer. And it wasn't until I completed a couple of tracks for the Pointer Sisters that Bill Schnee ended up mixing. And when I bought the album, it was like, whoa, it sounds nothing like it did in my studio.
Wow.
So there's some magic in there.
Well, whether you will acknowledge it or not, from the recording studio to, your seat in the executive office to the diner, you are a rock star, Piers Plaskitt. I cannot thank you enough for spending this time with me. I could speak another hour and a half with you, and we would have more stuff to cover. I urge everybody to check out your career, check out your mentorship. And again, I can't thank you enough for speaking with me.
You're so very welcome, Brian. It's a privilege. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the East Main podcast. This is Brian Brodeur. Please don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends and leave us a good rating. We'd really appreciate it. If you want to drop us a line, you can, of course, visit our website, eastmainmedia.com, and follow us on social media at eastmainmedia. And as always, please stay safe and healthy. Thanks for listening.